All right. So hi, everyone again, and thanks for joining for tonight's program. For those of you who are new faces to our virtual programs, my name is Faye Charpentier, and I'm the History Program Director at King's Chapel. Tonight's program is part of an ongoing series that we began in the fall called Uncovering and Confronting Our History, which focuses on examining and grappling with King's Chapel's difficult history with slavery and racial injustice, as well as the ongoing legacies of these histories. If you did miss any of the earlier programs in the series or are interested in watching them, we'll share a link to the recordings after we're done with tonight's program. And so tonight's talk, The Cost of Cotton, will focus on King's Chapel and its members' links with New England textile production and wealth creation dependent on enslaved individuals. In the 19th century, people across the globe were complicit in the brutal economy of cotton, harvested on southern plantations through enslaved labor and woven into textiles and mills throughout New England as well as Britain. While slavery had previously been abolished in Massachusetts in the 1780s, the region's economy and institutions continued to profit from slavery, which in turn fueled a vicious cycle of supply and demand between the textile industry as well as the enslavement in the southern United States. And so tonight we're going to look at some key players in these industries who worshipped at and financially supported King's Chapel, as well as some of the continued legacies of these systems. So we're looking at the cost. We'll primarily focus on enslavement, but we'll also discuss some of the environmental costs of these systems, and well as touch upon environmental racism and how it connects to some of these themes. And throughout the program tonight, I'd really encourage you to consider the question of what systems of oppression or violence we may be complicit with today through our everyday consumption as it relates to these themes. So as we enter the early decades of the 19th century, New England in many ways becomes synonymous with the impressive textile mills that blossomed along the region's rivers. And like I mentioned earlier, while slavery at this time was no longer in Massachusetts, the economy still depended on the cotton produced by enslaved people on plantations in the South. New England's mills, including some of the best known ones in Lowell, Massachusetts, were fueled by this cotton produced in the South. Some kind of numbers to give you a sense of the size of this industry and the impact in the New England economy and the United States economy as a whole is that in the year 1860 alone, New England mills consumed over 280 million pounds of cotton, which was 67% of the cotton produced by US mills that year. So a really large portion of textile production is taking place in New England. This global textile industry, which linked many nations and economies outside of the United States as well, was in many ways led by the northern United States as well as Britain. And it truly depended on the mass enslavement of African Americans at its very core. The two systems were really interdependent, and this was put really powerfully in this quote from Charles Sumner, who was a famed senator from Massachusetts, whose family worshipped at King's Chapel. And he describes these industries as, quote, an unholy union between the cotton planters and fleshmongers of Louisiana and Mississippi, and the cotton spinners and traffickers of New England, between the lords of the lash and the lords of the loom. If you were to ask kind of an average American on the street what image jumps to mind when they think about American slavery, more often than not, you may kind of get the answer that folks are envisioning slavery on southern cotton plantations in the first half of the 19th century. As I mentioned kind of several times already, the interwoven and intertwined industries between these plantations and textile production were so interwoven and central to the overall economy that despite over 200 years of enslavement in this country prior to then, this is the picture that often comes to mind as a default for American slavery. In King's Chapel, many of the church's elites in the early 19th century were involved in textile production. So we see familiar names of textile magnate families like Lowell, Boot, Appleton, also appearing in the pew rosters and the lay leadership of King's Chapel. And their family's wealth derived through these industries is linked to slavery in this way. As I said, names of several leading families in New England's textile industry do appear among the church's membership rosters, as well as literally on the walls of the church through memorials donated by families to honor their relatives in death. And like I said, some of these names include Boot, Appleton, and Lowell, but I'll also talk a little bit about a couple other folks, including Jackson and Ballister. So the first King's Chapel member who has ties to the textile industry that I'll talk about is Kirk Boot, this man here. And it's pictured image of Kirk Boot Jr. Next to a memorial plaque at King's Chapel honoring his father. While Kirk Boot Sr. himself was not involved in the textile industry, his son, who was also named Kirk Boot, was instrumental in the establishment and growth of cotton manufacturing in Lowell, Massachusetts. Kirk Boot Sr. Was originally born in Derby, England, before moving to King's Chapel when he moved to Boston in the 1780s. He was involved in the church leadership, serving on the vestry, which is essentially the leadership board of the church for over 20 years. He was involved in mercantile business, which his sons were involved in to varying degrees. And after his death in 1817, his son kind of took over the family business, but also became involved in textile production. While Kirk Boot Jr. does not appear explicitly on the membership rosters of the church, there are references that he worshiped alongside his family at King's Chapel as well. In the following years after his father's death, as I said, he took over the business interests, but became involved in the Boston and Merrimack manufacturing companies alongside Francis Cabot Lowell and members of King's Chapel, Patrick Tracy Jackson and Nathan Appleton. The boot mills, which were built in 1830s to manufacture cotton, shipped to New England from southern slave plantations, bear his name. These are located in Lowell, Massachusetts, were formerly part of their own distinct museum, but are now part of the National Historic Park in Lowell. And the family money that installed the bronze memorial to their family patriarch in 1889 was derived again from these textile industries. And now we'll take a little bit of a look at two King's Chapel members mentioned before, the Appletons as well as Patrick Tracy Jackson. So the first Appleton we'll talk about is Samuel Appleton, who there is a memorial plaque for him inside King's Chapel with kind of a depiction of him, which you can see kind of mirrors the portraits of him in photographs taken of his life during his life. He was born in the 1760s and had a long and varied career. He worked as a farmer, a teacher, shopkeeper, before starting a successful importing business with his brother Nathan. He was involved as a financial backer for the cotton mills in Waltham and Lowell, Massachusetts, alongside his brother. Today, he is best known for his legacy in philanthropy, but his wealth was derived from these industries as well. Nathan, however, is best known as a textile industrialist. This is a portrait of Nathan on the left, and on the right, this is an illustration of a power loom. As I mentioned earlier, Nathan Appleton, working closely with Francis Cabot Lowell, was influential in the introduction of cotton mills, as well as the power loom to New England. He owned mills in Lowell and Waltham as well, and he and Lowell constructed their own power loom in 1813. This device, which was first introduced in England in 1785, fully industrialized the textile industry, so integrating the entire process of producing textiles from raw cotton. And their initial mill was located in Waltham, Massachusetts. The introduction of these power looms to New England significantly increased the demand for cotton from Southern plantations worked by enslaved laborers, as they could now produce more fabric more efficiently. This industrialization in the North worked to fuel the expansion of plantations throughout the South, and contributed to the ongoing wealth creation amongst New England industrialists that remained linked to slavery in other parts of the United States. Turning to Patrick Tracy Jackson, he was, with these other men I mentioned, a founding member of the Boston Manufacturing Company. Jackson joined King's Chapel a bit later in life, when he was in his early 50s in 1831. So he had already been involved in textile production by the time he joined the church. He first became involved in business and in trade as an apprentice to a merchant during his teenage years, and subsequently entered the mercantile trade himself, and made a name for himself alongside Appleton as an investor, and alongside his brother-in-law, Francis Cabot Lowell, in establishing the Boston Manufacturing Company, which was that first fully industrialized textile mill in Waltham, Massachusetts in 1813. This mill, which is pictured on the left, was, as I mentioned, a really crucial part of kind of starting this larger demand for cotton in the northern states. As I mentioned, it really industrialized that full process from raw cotton to a finished textile that was produced and ready for market. After his brother-in-law Lowell's sudden death in 1817, Jackson and Appleton continued to partner together in future ventures in textile industry and other parts of Massachusetts. In his later years, he became involved in the railroad industry, which has its connections to the cotton production and textile industry as well, because transportation was, of course, a very important part of these industries. In the last several years before his death, he had a series of kind of failed business operations, yet the initial wealth that he earned and contributed as a member of King's Chapel derived from his work within the textile industries. And now back to the Lowell name, which I've mentioned a number of times throughout, which is kind of a big name when we talk about the textile industry in New England and in Massachusetts. While Francis Cabot Lowell, the first, was not a member of King's Chapel, several generations of Lowells, who are inheritance of the family wealth from his role in the textile manufacturing, did worship and financially support King's Chapel throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. This included Francis Cabot Lowell Jr., who was his son, his nephew, John Emery Lowell, and John Emery Lowell's grandson, Abbott Lawrence Lowell. After the original Francis Cabot Lowell's death in 1817, Jr. took over his father's role in the textile manufacturing and worked to increase the family's fortune through this and other business endeavors. John Emery Lowell and Abbott Lawrence Lowell were the most involved family members at King's Chapel in its history amongst Lowells. John Emery Lowell, who's pictured here, spent a good portion of his career working in the textile businesses, initially as a treasurer for the Merrimack Manufacturing Company, and the boot cotton mill in Lowell, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. And he also worked as a director for another textile company. So he kind of had his hands in many different aspects of running these operations. These positions were inherited by his son, Augustus Lowell, who was Abbott Lawrence Lowell's father. At King's Chapel, John Amory Lowell was also very involved in church politics, serving as a church warden in the 1840s, which is the highest position of lay leadership within the church. He also left his mark on King's Chapel through financial and material gifts. Most notably, he was the donor of the German stained glass windows, which were displayed in the chapel's chancel from the 1860s through the 1920s. And only one of these windows remains in the church. I'm just gonna get some water before I move forward. So unfortunately, due to the pandemic, I haven't been able to dive deeply into the church's historical financial records for research, but we do know that John Amory Lowell and his grandson Abbott Lawrence Lowell played major roles in the management of the church finances, and the grandson even more so than his grandfather. So on your screen, this is Abbott Lawrence Lowell, who's often referred to as A. Lawrence Lowell in his professional life, who's best known for his tenure as president of Harvard University from 1909 to 1933. While he was not directly involved in the textile industry, his career in higher education was made possible through the privilege provided to him by the family's wealth. And despite his contributions to the field of higher education, his legacy is deeply marred by his racism, anti-Semitism, and homophobia, which were all present in his work as university president. In 2019, Harvard University ended up removing Lowell's portrait from a major dining hall on campus in one of a series of efforts to confront his troubling legacy. At King's Chapel, Lowell served several roles as church treasurer, as a member of the vestry, and as a key player in establishing the church's trust and endowment in 1907. At that time, he was serving a term as church warden, as I mentioned, the highest lay position, and a relative, Francis Cabot Lowell III, served as one of the original 3 trustees, and the post is still named for him to this day. Beyond the limits of the church's walls, another member linked King's Chapel with the global cotton economy. This is not a picture of cotton, but sugarcane. I unfortunately wasn't able to find an image of this church member, Joseph Ballister, who is married to a daughter of Paul Revere, Maria Revere, was a merchant who became a US diplomat to Southeast Asia. He was the first US consul to Singapore in the 1830s, when American ships were granted equal trading rights with the East India Company. There in Singapore, he owned a large sugar plantation, as well as cotton plantations, which produced raw materials for the textile industry as well. And to this day, there are still streets, squares, and businesses in Singapore that bear his name. Having looked at some of the connections of King's Chapel and its members to a textile industry fueled by slave-produced cotton, it's important to focus back on the costs of this industry, namely the brutal reality of slavery and plantations, where the cotton that fueled these mills was produced. Slavery at the hands of European colonists has existed on the land now called the United States since the earliest English colonies, going back over 400 years. In our previous programs related to the church's history with slavery, we've discussed what slavery looked like in colonial Boston in the 1600s and 1700s, yet the institution grew and expanded exponentially with the introduction of industrialization. Advances in technology and transportation enabled the expansion of textile production and a greater ease of transporting raw materials and finished products. So looking at the colonial slave economy in New England, one of the major categories of products produced by enslaved labor were sugar related, so sugar, molasses, rum. But these advances in textile production increased the demand for cotton, which became the largest cash crop produced in the southern states, in many ways replacing some of the tobacco and sugar plantations that existed in the southern states and Caribbean during this time. Over a period of 60 years, so from about 1800 to 1860, cotton harvested by enslaved people in the United States increased by 400%. And taking, again, a single year, as I mentioned earlier, 1860, at the advent of the Civil War, New England mills were using over 280 million pounds of cotton. And just 10 years earlier, in 1850, about 3.2 million people were enslaved in the United States. So just take a moment to let that number sink in. That's 3.2 million people. Of these people subjected to enslavement, more than half of them at that time were involved in cotton production. Plantation systems relied on violence, oppression, and fear at their cores in an attempt by wealthy white enslavers to continue these brutal systems and forced labor. As kind of quote unquote productivity and efficiency of slave-produced cotton production grew, treatment and living conditions for enslaved men and women often decreased. And even from an environmental perspective, Southern cotton production is deeply troubling and unsustainable. The repeated and repeated planting and harvesting of cotton causes both soil erosion and degradation, as well as stripping the soil of nutrients, and can reach an unsustainable pace, which is still a concern in cotton production today. Also, cotton requires an immense amount of water compared to like hemp plants for making textiles. It uses about 5 times more water. Today, it's arguably the crop that requires the most water in its global production. And there's some research to suggest that the rates of cotton production and overuse of soil in southern fields throughout the 19th century depleted the soil quality in many ways permanently through erosion of the fertile topsoil. Institutionally, during this time period in the mid 19th century, King's Chapel and its leadership remained silent on anti-slavery and abolition. And it's possible that the number of key players in the textile industry who worshiped at the church and played a role in leadership of the church may have contributed to that silence. Even if they were not enslavers themselves, many relied on the brutal institution to generate their family's income. And members not involved in the textile industry also reaped the benefits of it and wore cotton in their daily lives. In many ways, it's easier for a lot of people to believe that these violent industries only had major benefits for the investors and owners of manufacturing companies, like some of the figures in King's Chapel's history discussed earlier. But white Americans of all social classes benefited from these systems through their everyday consumption. And there remains striking similarities to this in our lives today. Oftentimes, it can be challenging to digest for some folks the lasting legacies and impacts of enslavement in their daily lives, and to comprehend the extent of complicity. But the textile industry, I think, is a very tangible place where this is seen, in part because we're complicit in similar systems today. If you take a moment and consider what you're wearing, there's a pretty good chance that several items that you're wearing right now are made of cotton textiles. Cotton production remains one of the most pollutive industries today, continues to deplete natural resources, and also continues to rely on forced labor. In addition to the soil degradation and massive amounts of water required to grow cotton, cotton growers around the world use more insecticides than any other crop. And this is a major source of environmental racism seen today in the United States, where agricultural workers on industrial farms, who are predominantly people of color, paid low wages, are exposed to dangerous chemicals in the forms of insecticides and pesticides in their work and in their communities at levels that are unheard of in other areas. Both historically and today, the outcome of the crops is put above the welfare of the workers. A powerful discussion of the impacts of industrial farming, not in the context of cotton, but in a recent context in the United States, comes from Tomato Lands by Barry Estabrook, which focuses on the impacts of industrial farming in the tomato industry in Florida and communities of low income and forced farm labor. In the global cotton industry today, forced labor and child labor have been noted in 9 of the major cotton producing countries, which produce about 65% of the world's cotton. So the history of the global cotton economy, how Northern industrialists profited from slavery and fueled cotton production, and the contemporary legacies and parallels is an enormous topic to try to cover all parts of today. That said, we took a glimpse at a number of pieces of these larger histories, and I hope they'll be food for thought as we move forward and approach your understanding of history and of your own consumption. At the beginning, I encourage you to consider the questions of what systems of oppression we're complicit with through our everyday consumption. And it's through everyday decisions that we kind of confront these challenges and ethical questions. Two of the seemingly most basic questions that we ask ourselves every day: what to eat and what to wear, for instance.